Yes, Mr. Millett. Now you have another witness for us.
I do, Mr. Chairman, yes. Can I call, please, Mr. Nicholas Paget-Brown?
Good afternoon, Mr. Paget-Brown. I understand you're going to take the oath.
I am, sir.
Would you take the testament in your right hand, then, please, and read the words on the screen?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now sit down and make yourself comfortable. Yes, do take some water if you'd like some. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Pitt.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paget-Brown, good afternoon. Can I start by thanking you very much for attending this public inquiry and assisting us with our investigations? We're very grateful to you. If you have any difficulty understanding any of my questions, I'm happy to put the question again or frame it in a different way. Can I ask you to keep your voice up so that the transcriber who sits to your right can get down everything you're saying clearly and accurately? It also helps not to shake your head or nod, say no or yes, as the case may be. We're going to take a break at about 3:15 or 3:20 or so, but if you need a break at any other time, we can take a break. And if we go into tomorrow, the same will apply. I'm going to ask you about two statements that you've made to the inquiry. The first is RBK 3035001. If we can have that up. Is that the first page of your first witness statement?
Yes, it is.
If you go, please, to page 36, you can see that there's a date and a signature. The date is the 31st of October 2018, and the signature is just above it. Is that your signature?
Yes.
I'll call that your first statement. Can we next go to your second statement, please? RBK 3054428. Is that the first page of your second statement?
Yes.
If we can go to page 19, we can see a signature there above the date 26th September 2019. Is that your signature?
Yes.
I'll call that your second statement. Have you read your first and your second witness statements recently?
Yes, I have.
Now, I believe that there are some corrections that you wish to make to your statements. The first, I think, is in the first statement. Can we go, please, to page 5 in that and look at paragraph 17? And you see what you say there. I think it's right that at the time you drafted that paragraph, you didn't have the RBKC Cabinet and Leadership Team Membership Table in front of you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we look at that? It's RBK 50280. And if we open that, please. There it is. Is that, have you studied this table recently?
Yes, I have.
And do you accept it's accurate?
Yes, I do.
And in preference to what you said in your statement?
Yes, there's one additional member of my cabinet who I've omitted.
And that's Councillor Joanna Gardner?
Correct.
And she was Cabinet Member for Community Safety, IT and Corporate Services. Is this right, from the 23rd of May 2013 until the 24th of May 2016?
That's correct.
Thank you. Can we look at your second statement, please, at RBK 3054428, page 8, please. And at paragraphs 26 and 28 in there, where you're dealing with complaints and your correspondence log, you say at paragraph 26, in the first sentence, my correspondence log from December 2013 to June 2017, with records missing from June to December 2013, does not indicate any specific complaints about the Grenfell refurbishment. In fact, I think you want to add something at the end there, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And can you tell us, well, let me put it to you. I think you want to add there that should say, other than a complaint from Edward Daffarn, on 10th December 2014 about, quotes, illegal actions by RBKC planning and TMO re-windows.
That's correct.
And is it right that you requested a draft response from Laverne Parker about the procedure for making a formal complaint, and you replied to him on the 16th of December 2014?
Yes, that is also correct.
And the reference to that document I shall read into the record as TMO 100008268. I think you also want to make a correction to paragraph 28, if we can have that on the screen, please. You say there that I do not believe I received any specific complaints in my weekly mailbag relating specifically to Grenfell Tower other than the power surges of May 2013 referred to below. I think you want to add, don't you, and the complaint about the windows referred to above, in respect of which I requested a draft response from Laverne Parker. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yes, thank you very much. Other than those corrections that you've made to those statements, can you confirm that their contents are true, or are true with those corrections?
Yes, with those corrections, I believe they're true.
Have you discussed your statements or your evidence that you're going to give today with anybody before coming here today?
Only with the council's legal advisors.
Right. Now, I'm going to turn to your political career, please, first of all, and I'd like to ask you first about housing issues. But before I do that, can I ask you some prefatory questions about your involvement in local politics? It's right, I think, that you were appointed a councillor or elected councillor first in 1986.
Correct.
And at that time, is it right, you held a number of positions, and from that time, a number of positions in housing?
Yes, I was initially on the private sector housing committee, which was a subcommittee of the main housing committee. And 2 years later, I became chairman of the public sector housing committee, which was also a subcommittee of the main housing committee.
And from that time until 1996, is it right that RBKC managed its own housing stock, including its social housing stock?
Yes.
And in 1988, you were appointed, I think, chairman of the public sector housing committee.
Correct.
And you chaired the tenants consultative committee as well, I think.
Yes, I did.
And what did your role as chairman of both of those committees involve, in brief?
It involved looking at policy papers relating to the council's housing stock and the use of the housing stock and the pressures on the housing stock, the funding of it, and chairing committees of councillors who would then cross-examine officers of the then housing department about the contents of the paper and essentially hold them to account, raise questions that they had, and determine policy on public sector housing.
Is it right that you then became the vice chairman of a new committee in the early 1990s after housing and social services were merged?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you hold that position until you became deputy mayor in 1993?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes. Would it be fair to say that over that period you became intimately acquainted with management of RBKC's housing stock?
Yes, I think that's a fair conclusion.
Yes. Did you continue to be involved in issues concerning the management of RBKC's housing as deputy mayor?
To be perfectly honest, I can't now remember. There was a year where I was deputy mayor, and either I was still vice chairman of the housing and social services, or I'd started in my new set of responsibilities, but I can't now remember without looking it up.
Okay. Turning to the TMO, we know that the TMO was launched in 1996. Yes?
Yes.
And that was just a few years after you had been the vice chairman of the Housing and Social Services Committee. Now, do you remember the formation of the TMO being discussed during your time on the Housing Committee?
In general terms, yes, because there was new legislation going through at the time which set up the right to manage. And there was also, I think, a sort of national political bias against councils running their own housing stock with potentially running up big debts if they wish to refurbish or renew the stock. There was a thought, I think, that maybe housing could be transferred to housing associations. And I think in Kensington and Chelsea, the view of the tenants was they did not wish to transfer to a housing association. They would rather manage their own stock, and that was an option. So actually, I think we became the first tenant management organisation in the country to cover the whole of the borough, and it was it was launched nationally by a minister.
Right. Do you recall who it was who proposed that the TMO should be formed?
No, I think it would have been there would have been technical advice at the time that this was an option, and it probably would have been discussed with tenants, possibly at a tenants consultative committee meeting, and it would have emerged from that. But I slightly wasn't around during those discussions.
Yes, I see. Can we go to your first statement, please, at page 12 and look at paragraph 53? You say there at the foot of the page, under the heading Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation was formally launched in 1996 by the Right Honourable John Gummer, Secretary of State for the Environment. This was a few years after I'd been Vice Chair of the Housing and Social Service Committee and during my appointment as Chair of the Environment Committee. It's my understanding that the TMO was formed in response to changes in legislation and a desire by tenants to avoid the council's housing stock being transferred to a housing association where it was possible that rents would rise more sharply. Do you know, or can you remember, how that desire on the part of the tenants was communicated to the council?
Well, I can't in detail remember how that would have happened, but as I say, I wasn't actually involved with housing during the sort of intensity of those discussions. But it would have probably been through the Tenants Consultative Committee, which met, I think, regularly, and sort of more informal in the margins discussions between councillors, tenants, officers, that this might be a viable way of not having to transfer the stock to a housing association.
And in paragraph 54, you say, following the launch of the KCTMO, RBKC took the decision to transfer all of its housing stock to the TMO. Does that mean that the TMO was formed before that decision was made?
I don't remember. I would have thought the decision would have been made and then the KCTMO would have been established, but that's pure speculation.
Yes, well, I understand why you say that, and that's why I asked the question. Can you help us as to why, at least according to your statement here, the decision was made to transfer all the housing stock to the TMO after the decision was made to set it up?
Well, again, my memory is not completely clear on this, but I think the idea that you might have a small organisation within the borough that was running some of the housing, a small tenant management association, was thought not to lend the economies of scale. You'd end up with a small organisation here, which was a mini TMO. You would end up perhaps with a rump of a council housing department. You might transfer a bit of the stock to a housing association. So you would end up with a muddle, whereas if you have one borough-wide organisation, you would get economies of scale. You could see the management working across the borough, and that would be a better solution.
Was that the thinking at the time?
I believe it was.
Right, and does that explain why RBKC decided to move the management of its whole housing stock to the TMO?
I think so, yes.
Was there any consideration, do you remember, at the time of whether the TMO was adequately structured and resourced to ensure that it could discharge all of its responsibilities that it had undertaken in respect of the entirety of RBKC's housing stock?
Well, I can't remember that. As I say, I was no longer really involved in the detail of those discussions. I've moved on to a different area of responsibility on the council. But it would seem to me that you would transfer what had once been the in-house council's housing department with the different structures, different areas of responsibility, and you would transfer them completely in one 100% piece to the new organisation.
Yes.
That's essentially, I believe, what happened.
Yes, but my question is really, when that decision was made to transfer the entirety of the housing stock, what consideration was given to whether the TMO was adequately resourced and structured so as to be able to manage that entire stock?
I really don't think I can answer your question on that. I don't know.
All right. Moving forward in time, you chaired the Environment Committee. When did you take that position up? Do you remember?
I think it was responsibilities change every May, and I think it was probably either May 1993 or May 1994, but I can't now remember which. It's that period of overlap with my deputy mayoralty.
Yes, I see. And in 2000, you became the borough's cabinet member for regeneration, community safety and the voluntary sector.
Yes.
That's right. And you were, I think, also appointed Chief Whip for the Conservative Group. Is that
Yes,
correct?
correct.
And you managed that portfolio, is this right, until you became Deputy Leader of RBKC in 2011?
I was the Chief Whip until 2011, but my portfolio area of responsibility changed, I think, in 2006, or it might have been 2007, when I became the Cabinet Member for Environment, and then 2 years later, the Cabinet Member for Environment and Transport and Leisure.
Right. And then you became Leader in May 2013.
Correct.
And then resigned on the 30th of June 2017 after the Grenfell Tower fire.
Correct.
I want to ask you some questions now about the constitution of RBKC, please. And you cover this in some detail at paragraphs 12 to 16 of your first statement, and you exhibit some documents. We don't need to look at that specifically at this stage, but were you familiar in general with the constitution during your time as Deputy Leader and then Leader?
I'm not very familiar with all of it, but familiar with parts of it where I needed to be familiar with it.
Well, let's see how we go. So you never sat down and read it cover to cover?
No.
Can we look at RBK 3035017, please? This is Appendix B to the Constitution, and it's entitled Royal Borough's Member-Level Governance Arrangements as at May 2015. Which is at the top of the screen there, and you have full council, and on the left, council side committees, and on the right, the executive, and scrutiny sits between the two. And you describe that in paragraph 13 of your first witness statement as representing the member-level governance arrangements. Does this diagram or organogram reflect the structure of the governance arrangements throughout your time as Deputy Leader and then Leader of the Council?
Yes, one or two of the scrutiny committee titles changed, but essentially they were the same type of area. And yes, that looks a familiar structure to me.
Yes, I see. Now, turning to the full council, that sits at the top, as you can see.
Yes.
And the role of full council was governed by Article 4 of the Constitution, wasn't it? You know that? Do you know that?
I don't remember which article of the Constitution.
Right. Well, this isn't going to be a test on the Constitution,
right.
Particularly. I just want you to help me confirm what's in it. Can we go to RBK 3035002? And on page 1 of that document, this is part 2 of the Constitution, Article 4, the full council. You see it?
Yes.
And under 401, you can see that it would have 50 elected councillors and would meet in 3 ways: annual meeting, ordinary meetings, and extraordinary meetings conducted in accordance with the standing orders. I take it you were familiar at least with that?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And then if you look down at paragraph or article 4.04, it defines the full council's terms of reference. And you can see that there. A, particularly, to approve and adopt the following plans and strategies subject to any variation that may from time to time be made in response to legislation and which together make up the council's budgetary and policy framework. And then there's a list, and you can see them there.
Yes.
And if you look over the page, please, to Article 4.04D or 04D, top of page 2, one of the things was to appoint the leader of the council at the post-election annual meeting or any subsequent meeting.
Yes.
Do we take it that you were elected leader by the full council?
Yes, I was elected leader by the full council, having first been elected leader of the majority party, the biggest party of the council. So the biggest party has a leader, the minority party also has a leader, and the leader of the biggest party is then elected by the full council once a year.
Yes. And just on that occasion, does the Constitution change to identify the leader by name?
I'm not trying to understand your question. Does this document change?
Yes.
Don't think so.
Right. Well, we'll come back to that shortly. If we continue on this page, look at L, subparagraph or sub-article L, to consider those matters referred to it from time to time by scrutiny committees and by other council committees. How often in practice were issues referred by scrutiny committees to the full council?
Occasionally, not regularly. I mean, I think it sort of went up and down a bit, but occasionally scrutiny would refer something to the council and it would be debated, or somebody would move a motion and that would be debated. But
do you recall during your time as leader or as deputy leader if any issues regarding housing, particularly, were referred by the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee to full council?
I don't remember that.
Right. Does it follow from that, I think it probably does, that no issues concerning Grenfell Tower specifically were referred to full council by the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee during your time as leader?
Not that I recall, no.
Or as deputy leader?
I don't think so.
Right. Moving to Cabinet, can we please go to RBK 3035010? This is in a different part of the Constitution. This is Part 2, Article 7. And at 7.01, we have the executive, and under A, it says the executive is responsible for undertaking all of the council's functions except for those functions specified in Article 4 and Part 3 of the Constitution that are reserved to the council and that are undertaken by the full council or delegated by the council to committees, subcommittees, if any, and or officers. When the executive meet collectively, it's known as the cabinet. Individual councillors that are members of the executive are known as cabinet members. It's fair to say, is it then, looking at that, that the role of cabinet was to have responsibility for anything that was not the responsibility of the full council or council committees?
Yes.
Yes. And if we look down the page to the foot of the page, please, can we scroll down to Article 7.04, other cabinet members? That says in A, the leader appoints the other cabinet members and notifies the Director of Strategy and Local Services of their appointments. So is it the leader, or was it the leader, who would decide the portfolios of individual cabinet members?
Yes.
During the majority of the time that you occupied the seat as leader, it's right to think that, isn't it, that Councillor Feilding-Mellen from 2013 was the deputy leader?
Yes.
And he was also the cabinet member for Housing, Property and Regeneration.
Yes.
Do you know why you appointed Councillor Feilding-Mellen in particular to those roles?
Yes. Prior to either of us holding those positions, we'd had discussions, informal discussions about housing issues, about the future of our housing stock as a borough. Rock had been elected as a councillor in North Kensington for 4 years, I think between 2006 and 2010. So he'd had some experience of some of the social housing issues and housing associations. He worked or had set up, as I understand it, a consultancy specialising in property and planning type issues. He lived in North Kensington, and I thought he would be a very good person to be involved with regeneration and housing.
He was, I think, some 34 years old or so at that stage.
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, was that and he told us yesterday that although that wasn't particularly young, looking across the country, it was unusually young for RBKC. Did it strike you at the time that he was a particularly young candidate for the post?
Not unduly.
It didn't?
No, it struck me I was beginning to be at the top end of the age range on the council, and we needed to bring forward some younger people, and his name lent itself to that.
Right. Looking at Article 707, please, if we go over the page, 7.07. Yes, that's it, page 2. Under A, the Cabinet usually meets on a monthly basis, but the leader keeps this arrangement under review. The leader chairs the meetings. There are leaders' meetings at approximately monthly intervals, i.e. between Cabinet meetings. What was the purpose of the leaders' meetings, which were held in private?
Yeah, the purpose of a leaders' meeting is to discuss some of the issues which are likely to come forward to the Cabinet, or particular issues which are of concern to an individual Cabinet member, where perhaps different options need to be explored before a final Cabinet paper can be produced. So it's an informal, well, it's a structured meeting, which is properly clerked, but it does give members of the Cabinet a chance to discuss, debate, test ideas before they become rather more set in aspect and become a Cabinet paper for formal approval at a formal Cabinet meeting.
Were those meetings minuted?
Yes, they were.
They were. Are those the meetings you refer to at paragraph 28 of your first witness statement on page 7? If we can just have a look back at that, please. You refer to meetings with individual Cabinet members there, a town clerk and the directors from the relevant department. Are those the meetings that are covered in Article 7.07?
No, they're not. These
Right.
are different. These are different meetings. Would you like me to cover
Yes,
what
please.
these meetings are?
Yes, what are those meetings?
These are meetings I had once a year with individual cabinet members, usually in January, February time, where I would have the appropriate cabinet member, the executive director who advised them, the town clerk and chief executive, and any other very senior officer thought to be relevant. So we could discuss particular issues within that portfolio, issues which might come forward during the year, issues which were likely to be controversial, issues perhaps where the cabinet member would like to have a steer either from me or from the chief executive. And in a sense, they were to try to differentiate from a meeting we would then have 6 months later to review the financial position, to agree budgets for the next 3-year period. So we didn't muddle up budgets with sort of policy issues and general direction of travel. But they weren't the same as the leaders group, which was sort of, if you like, informal cabinet meetings that took place broadly once a month.
Yes, I see. And were the the meetings you're referring to in your answer just now minuted?
In paragraph 28?
Yes.
Yes, they were.
They were. Can we look back, please, at Article 7 and go within that previous document, please, to page 3? And under 7.07, do you... I'm sorry, you need to go to page 3. Under 7.08, delegation of functions, you can see little a, it says this: the functions set out in part 3.a of this constitution have been delegated by the leader to the cabinet member and or executive director or director. Now, we'll come back to part 3a in a moment. I just ask you to note that for the time being. I now want to ask you about key decisions. If you look a little bit further down at page 3, you'll come to the very foot of the page, and we'll need to turn to page 4. This is Article 7.10, the decision-making process. Over onto page 4, you'll see that in Article 7.10b, definition of key decisions, a key decision will be any executive side matter that is not already delegated to officers which, 1, involves income or expenditure of £100,000 or more, and or 2, is likely to have a significant impact on the community in one or more electoral wards. Is it right that the decision to refurbish Grenfell Tower was a key decision within the meaning of Article 7.10b?
Yes, it was. It would have been a key decision for the whole cabinet.
Right. Can we then go down to Article 7.10 H at page 6? Under key decision making, and it says this: key decisions are made either by the full cabinet or by individual cabinet members. And then if you look at I to K, you'll see that there is a description of the procedure to be adopted if the key decision is to be made by cabinet or the individual cabinet member. If you just scroll down onto page 7, please, you'll see that. And you can see that there's a distinction between individual cabinet members and cabinet. In general terms, Mr. Paget-Brown, how was it decided whether a key decision was to be made by the cabinet or an individual cabinet member?
Well, other
In general
than
terms.
Yes. Other than the sort of financial thresholds involved, there will be a thought by the cabinet member that perhaps a controversial matter was going to be decided upon, which technically they might be able to take a key decision on their own, but it would be prudent perhaps to bring it to the cabinet and get collective agreement that that was the way forward. So something which may not be financially particularly expensive, but might be controversial or difficult, they would want the full cabinet to take a decision on that, and that would be agreed between me and the cabinet member, and occasionally we would discuss it with the town clerk. But the idea was to have as much flexibility as possible so that somebody could bring something to the cabinet for a collective agreement.
And the decision to have a key decision made by a cabinet member or the full cabinet was a decision, I think you say, made between you, the town clerk, and the particular cabinet member.
Yes, I think a lot of decisions are very, what you might call routine. They're not either controversial or particularly expensive, and councils collectively take a lot of decisions over the course of a year. So most things can be, decisions can be put on the forward plan, the decision can be notified, taken by the individual cabinet member, and there's no controversy, and it's straightforward, but it's taken in public. You can see all the detail. Key decisions are on the forward plan. As I say, where it's more controversial, you may want collective agreement to it, so it's then a cabinet decision. And if there are certain financial thresholds, or it's taking the council in a different or new direction, then that should come to the full cabinet.
Is it right that the decision to refurbish Grenfell Tower was made by the whole cabinet?
Yes.
And whose decision was that to have it decided by the full cabinet? Was that yours?
Well, it would have been the leader at the time that the decision to refurbish Grenfell Tower was taken, who was my predecessor.
I see. So that would be 2012.
Yes, that was the first time I saw a cabinet paper, I think.
Right. Now, can we go to RBK 3035007, page 1, which is part 3.A of the Constitution, which I said I'd come back to. This is entitled Responsibility for Functions, and if you look at Article 1.1 under A, Executive Functions, you'll see it says this: the leader of the council is Nicholas Paget-Brown. Details of those members he has appointed to his cabinet are published on the council website and are available also by calling governance services on, and then there's a telephone number.
Yes.
This is the reason I asked you whether the Constitution was updated every time a new leader was appointed. We see you're named specifically there. Is that because, as I asked you, the Constitution is updated every time there's a new leader, or because it was updated during your time and a decision was taken to name you there?
Well, I don't know why my name in particular appears there. It's all quite accurate. But the leader might decide the names of the portfolios, or might make some changes to what responsibilities are. So maybe when I became leader, I made some changes from the structure my predecessor had, and maybe those are set out there for clarity. I can't see what the document goes on to say, but I had made some changes to people's positions.
Right. Can you explain why you're named specifically?
I can't really, no.
Right. Then let's look on down to page 4 in this part and look at Article 1.7. This is entitled The Functions and Portfolios of Individual Cabinet Members, and it starts Leader of the Council. And Article 1.7 provides the scope of the leader's responsibilities spans all portfolios, ensuring coordination and a coherent approach to the council's decision-making. The leader can make any decision which is delegated to an individual cabinet member or to the cabinet. And then it goes on to identify a number of activities, as you can see. If you look down at little Roman 4, it refers to the council's contribution to the life of the royal borough and to the capital and sub-region. Would that include housing?
Yes.
And I suppose housing would fall into quite a few of these categories, would it? For example, strategies under Little Roman 1,
Yes.
and overall control of the revenue and capital finances under 2.
Yes.
Yes. Would you have considered, or did you consider, Little Roman 4 to have included taking responsibility for projects such as the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower?
No, I didn't.
No. If we look at Little Roman 5, the functioning of the Council's cabinet, including the allocation of responsibilities to the full cabinet and individual cabinet members, the appointment and dismissal of those cabinet members, and the delegation of executive authority to officers. Were you, in your role as leader, ultimately responsible for ensuring that the cabinet member for housing, property and regeneration was discharging their responsibilities properly?
Yes, I was.
And under Roman 6, partnership working across the council's services, including liaison with other statutory agencies in and outside the borough, would that have included working with the TMO?
Yes.
As a service provider, and as a statutory agency, would that have included the LFB, London Fire Brigade?
Yes.
Can we then move down to page 5 and look specifically at article at 1.8 on that page? Thank you. Yes, under the heading Deputy Leader and Cabinet Member for Housing, Property and Regeneration. And it provides there, at some length, as you can see on your screen, for the details of what that portfolio was concerned with. I'm not going to read it all out to you, but you can see that it has a large number of matters, each under a set of italics. But the first 12 sub-articles under Article 1.8 are to do with housing matters. You see that?
Yes.
Was it customary for the deputy leader also to hold a cabinet position with a specific portfolio?
Yes.
And was it you who decided that Feilding-Mellen, when he became deputy leader, should hold the portfolio of cabinet member for housing, property and regeneration?
Yes.
So the linkage between deputy leader and cabinet member for housing, property and regeneration was particular, was it, to Mr. Feilding-Mellen?
Yes, there was always a deputy leader of the council, and that whoever the deputy leader was held different portfolios according to their experience, interests, expertise, and what the leader wanted to get done. So,
Yes.
as I explained earlier, my view was that Feilding-Mellen would be a good, not only a good deputy leader, but a good cabinet member for housing, regeneration and property.
Yes. I'm interested in this because just as we saw you specifically named under the leader part of the Constitution, here we see a portfolio linking the deputy leader and the cabinet, the role of cabinet member for housing, property and regeneration. And that link, is this right, was purely because both of those roles were given to Feilding-Mellen. So in fact, this is describing him.
Yes, I can't quite place this document, but it looks to me as if whoever prepared it shortly after I had become leader, and then put in these either my name or who I had chosen as deputy or other portfolio titles. And it's slightly odd, but it does cover the ground that they are supposed to be responsible for.
Yes, put it this way: if Feilding-Mellen had ceased to be deputy leader for whatever reason, then the heading of this part of this part of the Constitution would have to be redrafted, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So this is specific really to him, and you can see all the items for housing there. Does it tell us that? Sorry, let me just ask you this by reference to paragraph Roman 1. It says under housing matters, all social housing regeneration projects. And under Little Roman 8, the tenant management organisation, management agreement and regulation. You see that there?
Yes.
Does that mean that ultimate responsibility for oversight of fire safety within the TMO's stock lay with the cabinet member for housing, property and regeneration?
Well, it would be an area of responsibility for the cabinet member, but the tenant management organisation had its own line of accountability to its own board.
Yes.
I believe had structures to reflect that, and its own relationship with the London Fire Brigade. So I suppose there's a triangulation, and yes, I would certainly expect the cabinet member to include fire safety in that.
Yes.
In that role, in that set of responsibilities.
Yes, thank you. And by virtue of Article 1.7 Roman 5 we looked at earlier, do you accept it was your job to ensure that that cabinet member, the person holding the role of cabinet member for housing, property and regeneration, performed their job properly?
Yes.
Yes. And stepping back from the detail we've just been examining, do you agree that by virtue of the Constitution, you had responsibility for both social housing projects and the proper management of the TMO?
Yes.
Do you agree that your responsibilities as leader of the council extended to the welfare of the residents of RBKC's housing stock?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions next about the scrutiny committee. First of all, did you ever receive any training in relation to how to conduct scrutiny?
I don't think I did, because weirdly, I don't think I ever sat on a scrutiny committee, because when the cabinet and scrutiny committee system was set up in 2000, I joined the cabinet, so I don't think I'd ever sat on a scrutiny committee. But I know in those early days, arrangements were made to provide training for members who sat on scrutiny committees, and I believe we had either one or two MPs who chaired select committees at the House of Commons come and run a session. I seem to remember Mrs. Gwyneth Dunwoody came on one occasion.
Right. Right. Let's look at a document. This is INQ 30146171 at page 90. I should show you. I probably ought to show you page 1 actually of this document, just to show you what it is. This is the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy's Delivering Good Governance guidance. And it's the 2016 edition. We haven't been able to trace an earlier edition. I'm not saying there isn't one. It's got a memorable front page. Just looking at it, is it a document you think you've ever seen before?
No.
No. Let's look at page 90 nonetheless, and look at paragraph 6.9 with me, under the heading Principles of Good Scrutiny. And it says, the Centre for Public Scrutiny has established 4 core principles of good scrutiny. First bullet, provides critical friend challenge to executive policymakers and decision takers. Second bullet, enables the voice and concerns of the public. Third bullet, is carried out by independent-minded councillors who lead and own the process. Fourth bullet, drives improvement in public services. And goes on, local authority overview and scrutiny committees have the power to summon members of the executive and officers of the authority before it to answer questions, and they're able to invite other persons to attend meetings to give their views or submit evidence. Are those principles familiar to you, or were they familiar to you at the time you were leader?
Well, they absolutely encapsulate what I understood and expected a scrutiny committee to do. I'm not sure I've ever seen these set out. Well, I haven't seen this document as far as I know. But yes, those look very reasonable to me.
They look, yes, yes. Were these principles, can you recall, the subject of any specific training that members of the scrutiny committee underwent during your time, either as deputy leader or leader?
I don't know the answer to that, other than to say newly elected members of the council went through some quite rigorous training, had some sort of training induction courses, and I'm sure something like this would have featured, but I can't go any further than that.
You're speculating, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Did you yourself seek to foster these principles when you were deputy or leader of the council?
Yes, I did. I had just started, probably no more than a year before my leadership came to an end, trying to have some informal gatherings with each of the scrutiny committees across all members, all parties, just so they could come in and see me and talk about some of the issues that they were concerned about or which needed dealing with, or where perhaps I could talk to them about things that I thought were of interest. So that was another link between the leadership and the scrutiny committees. And of course, any chairman of any scrutiny committee could always come and see me. I mean, there was no suggestion they couldn't, but there was supposed to be this separation, so I thought it was.
Yes. You say this started no more than a year before your leadership came to an end. Now, your leadership came to an end at the end of June 2017, so
Yes.
this would have been in 2016, would it have been?
Yes.
So from the middle of 2016 onwards. Right. What was it that caused you to take this view at that time, or approach from that time?
Well, I was just a bit concerned that as leader, you can spend a lot of time talking to cabinet members who take executive decisions, but you're not always talking to the scrutiny committee, some of whom contain fairly new members, newly elected members, opposition members. And I just thought there was a danger there might become a gulf between me as leader and the scrutiny committees, particularly as I remember, I think it was about 2 or 3 years before I became leader, rather than the leader appointing the chairman of the scrutiny committees, which had been the practice, party colleagues took a decision that they wanted to elect the chairman of the scrutiny committee, so I had no particular, I had some influence over who became members of scrutiny, but not who the chairman were.
Was there a particular event that caused you to rethink into 2016 and adopt a more, as it were, open door policy towards scrutiny committees?
No, but I think I was getting more into my stride as leader and realising there were certain areas where I felt that actually, one could make some innovations. This wasn't a huge innovation, just to come in once a year and have a drink and chat about issues that were of concern to the committee.
Right.
I thought that would be a good thing to do.
You say you were getting into your stride. This was after 3 years.
Yes.
It's quite a long time to get into your stride.
It takes quite a long time to master the range of issues that, as leader of a council, you're responsible for.
In your view, either at this time in 2016 or before that, did you think there were a sufficient number of council officers exercising scrutiny over the TMO, having regard to the TMO's size, or rather the size of its estate?
I had never considered whether there were enough officers. I knew the TMO, I think, employed more than 200 members of staff, so and both the TMO and the council were operating in a very difficult financial climate. I mean, headcount was always an issue. There were all sorts of pressures on council costs and spending. So I think if it had been a suggestion that we have many more officers, I probably wouldn't have reacted terribly warmly towards it.
Yes, we may have been at cross purposes. I'm talking about numbers of RBKC people exercising scrutiny over the TMO. That was my question, rather than headcount within the TMO itself. Shall I pose my question?
Well, sorry, either headcount within the TMO because they had pressures on the housing revenue account, and headcount
Right.
within RBKC because we had pressures on our revenue support grant from central government. So it wasn't the time to be expanding staff numbers greatly.
I see. Can we look then at another document, RBK 3063727? Now, this is an RBKC document from Part 5 of the Constitution called D, Local Code of Corporate Governance. Are you familiar with this, just looking at it on the screen?
Corporate governance.
Yes, I should tell you, this dates from 2011.
I think I will have seen it. It's sort of looking familiar, but I can't say I've got detailed knowledge of this document. But
Right.
I think I will have seen something on corporate governance.
Right. Looking at the first paragraph under the introduction, it says this: governance is about how local government bodies ensure that they are doing the right things in the right way for the right people in a timely, inclusive, open, honest and accountable manner. It comprises the systems and processes, cultures and values by which local government bodies are directed and controlled and through which they account to, engage with and, where appropriate, lead their communities. Timely, inclusive, open, honest and accountable. Do you agree with those principles of how RBKC should go about doing things?
Yes.
Yes. Now, the code sets out, in fact, 6 principles. We could scroll down and look at them all, but can we go to the 4th principle on page 3, please? Principle 4, it's called. On page 4, I'm sorry. And it says, Principle 4, taking informed and transparent decisions which are subject to effective scrutiny and managing risk. The Royal Borough, and then it goes on to say a lot, under a lot of bullet points. The first of which, though, is this: develops and maintains an effective scrutiny function which encourages constructive challenge and enhances the authority's performance overall and that of any organisation for which it is responsible. And then develops and maintains open and effective mechanisms for documenting evidence for decisions and recording the criteria, rationale and considerations on which decisions are based. I've only read you 2 excerpts from this long list, but can we take it from those? First, that decisions should be transparent and subject to effective scrutiny.
Yes.
And second, that scrutiny should lead to constructive challenge which improves RBKC and also the TMO as an organisation for which the RBKC was responsible.
Yes.
And do you also agree, thirdly, that decisions should be open and effective in meeting that aim?
Yes.
Yes. Now, I want to turn to the decision to refurbish Grenfell Tower, and also in that connection, the budget, if I can. Can we start, Mr. Paget-Brown, with your second witness statement, please, at paragraph 6 on page 2. You say this: at the time the initial decision was made to renovate the tower in 2012, I was the deputy leader and cabinet member for Environment, Transport and the Arts. I was not, nor would have been, privy to the detailed discussions between the then leader, cabinet member for Housing and Property, and senior officers in the Housing Department, members of Kensington and Chelsea's tenant management organisation, the TMO, or other relevant departments and persons. On this basis, there are some questions which I'm not able to answer as fully as others. And if you go to paragraph 64 of your first witness statement, I don't think you need to see it, in fact, it's on page 8. You say that you were involved in the project to construct a new Kensington leisure centre, and you say there that your key was to research the scope of that project.
Yes.
Was your involvement with the Kensington Leisure Centre project continuing when the Director of Housing's report about the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower was presented to Cabinet on the 2nd of May 2012?
Yes, it would have been. Yes.
It would have been. Can we look at the minute for that meeting, please, at TMO 008473331? That is not. It's not the minute. In fact, it's the report of that for that meeting. Do you remember reading that report at the time?
Yes.
Was that the first time you had heard about the suggestion to refurbish Grenfell Tower?
I think I probably heard sort of informal discussions that it might happen, but I hadn't paid great attention to them. And then this paper came to Cabinet. So, yeah, this is the first sort of written document I've seen, but I think I'd heard it mentioned.
Right. Do you remember whether you had any discussions with anyone from the Housing Department before the Cabinet meeting on the 2nd of May 2012?
Me personally?
Yes.
I don't think I would have done, no.
You say you wouldn't have done, or you don't think you would have done. Is that because it wasn't your habit to do so?
Yes, I was not the Cabinet member for Housing. It seemed to me wonderful that there was some capital receipts from the Elm Park Gardens, which I did understand where that money had come from, and that my colleague in Housing wanted to spend that on Grenfell Tower. It seemed a thoroughly good idea.
Was the refurbishment or proposed refurbishment discussed at that meeting, do you recall?
Yes, I believe it was, yes.
Can we look at your second witness statement, paragraph 9 on page 3? And you say there, in the second sentence, the Cabinet would have the opportunity to ask for further information or clarification from the Director of Housing, Cabinet Member for Housing, Property and Regeneration, or other officers present at the meeting. Do you remember asking any questions yourself at the Cabinet meeting about the Grenfell Tower refurbishment?
I really can't remember back that far. I think it was more than years ago, but I might have asked a question based on my loose knowledge of Grenfell Tower from those years, many years before, when I'd been had responsibility for public sector housing. And I do remember, I think Grenfell Tower was one of the very few in the borough that didn't have any outside space, any balconies. And I think I was wondering whether we might be fitting balconies or whatever. But that's the only possible.
What was your loose knowledge of Grenfell Tower from your years when you had responsibility for public sector housing?
Well, I think I visited, I can't remember. I seem to remember it had quite a grim entrance right at it was part of the Lancaster West development, so there was the 3 finger blocks, which were the low-rise blocks, and then an entrance to the tower at the end of them, and it wasn't a good piece of public realm. I remember thinking that all those years ago. And as I say, there were no outside balconies, which a number of the high-rises do have balconies. And I think I picked up over the years just occasional comments, oh, Grenfell, it's a very, the heating's not right, and they have problems with windows and things, all this sort of thing. So when this came along, I would have been wholly supportive of it, I'm sure.
There was... Yes, let's look back at the report then, produced for Cabinet by Laura Johnson, TMO 008473331, please, which we looked at a moment ago. Can we go to page 8 in that document and look at paragraph 6.3.3 at the foot of the page? It says this: based on the TMO's information on investment need and the aspirations of the TMO board and the Lancaster West Estate Management Board, EMB, the recommendation is therefore that funds from the Elm Park Gardens capital receipt be set aside for investment into renovation, regeneration and conversion works to Grenfell Tower on the Lancaster West Estate. The benefits anticipated to arise from this will be. And then there's a long list of bullet points there. You see?
Yes.
Now, they include, if you look at the second bullet point down, installing thermally insulated cladding and rain screen curtain walling system to the uninsulated external elevations of Grenfell Tower, significantly improving thermal efficiency, fuel economy, and providing for an external appearance that reflects and complements the adjoining calc project. As you can see from what I've just read to you, is it right that one of the purposes of cladding Grenfell Tower was to integrate it aesthetically with the calc project?
I'm not quite sure how you could integrate a tower with an academy building and then a leisure centre. I don't think they can quite. I mean, they are very different buildings with very different purposes. I think what I was interested by and pleased by was the thought of putting thermally insulating cladding around the building. I'd seen lots of other buildings all over London and other parts of the country where they had been refurbished and cladding had gone up on the outside, and people had said that they're now much more thermally efficient, energy efficient. I'd been the cabinet member for the environment. We were trying to cut our carbon emissions, so it seemed to me that cladding had all sorts of positive, sadly positive purposes.
Right. Do you recall any particular discussion at this meeting of the thermal performance of the building?
I'm not sure if it was at this meeting, but yes, I'm sure people said, Grenfell Tower is very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter. The windows are not right, the windows drafty. And so the thought that this might be able to be put right was attractive.
Did you? I mean, you could see the list of benefits set out there. Did you or any other member of the cabinet raise any concerns at this meeting about, or any questions at this meeting about fire safety?
No.
Did you ask whether a fire consultant had been instructed, as it had been, or as one had been for the calc project?
I don't think at this meeting, no, but one would expect as the project developed that different consultants with different expertise would be appointed, and that would all take place. But I think this was more a general scoping. This is a proposal. We've got some money. This is a project we could spend it on, and I don't think we were at the detailed stage at this point.
I see. Did you ask further questions regarding the scope of the works when the Cabinet approved the increase in the budget to £9.7 million in July 2013?
I can't remember what was in that paper, but I suspect we already had agreed the scoping of the project had been set out. I think progress had been made, presumably on tendering, and they came back requesting more money, which we approved.
You approved. Did you yourself ask any questions, or do you remember any questions being asked about the precise reasons for the increase from 6 odd million to 9.7 odd million pounds?
I don't, but I don't think it would have been a big surprise, because I think 6 million was an initial allocation to get the project rolling and start hiring people, and at some point you go out to tender, and that's when the bill becomes a lot clearer. So you have to reflect that.
Yes. And do you recall that in June 2014, the budget for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment was increased from £9.7 million to £10.3 million?
Yes, I do.
Do you remember asking any questions about why that was?
At some point, I think I would have asked the question because I have been lobbied by ward councillors about the nursery play, the boxing club, and whether those could be incorporated into the works. And I was quite keen that they were incorporated into the works. I'm not quite sure now whether the contingency was to cover the cost of that, or the contingency was just a standard financial housekeeping measure. But it wouldn't have surprised me if we, had to find a bit more for the contingency. That's quite common.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a couple more questions and two more things to show the witness. I'm happy to take the break now, but I will get.
Well, are they linked to what you?
They are.
Well, I should carry on from there.
They are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we go, please, to your first witness statement, page 16, paragraph 68? First witness statement, page 16, paragraph 68. And you say there, at the Cabinet meeting on the 18th of July 2013, MPB4, following more detailed costings and the decision to retender, the Cabinet was asked to increase the budget for the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower to £9.7 million. And then in your second statement, if we can just look at that, page 14, paragraph 46, you're answering a question there about the basis of the decision to retender. And you say any decision to retender would be a decision for the TMO. The Cabinet were only required to authorise the finance for the project. Do you recall asking why the project was being retendered?
I don't think I asked, but I think there may have been a discussion about why it was being retendered.
Do you recall that? Do you recall somebody asking, if not you, the question, why is the project being retendered?
I think the question was asked, but I really can't remember now who asked it or the detail of it. I think it was just that I think there'd originally been an expectation that the work could all be done as one by one contractor, and I think as things developed, it became clear that actually wasn't possible, and that you would need somebody separate to do the tower because the skills of the contractor weren't appropriate. I think it was something like that, but
right.
I don't think it was my question that prompted that.
No. You say you do recall a question being asked.
I think so, yes.
And you've given us, I think, a hint of what the answer was. Can you be a little clearer, perhaps, in your recollection of what the answer was to the question, why is the Grenfell Tower project being retendered?
Well, I assume either the tender was the tenders received were too high, or that we had expected that the contractor working on the academy and the leisure centre would work on the tower, and then had found that for some reason they couldn't, or they were too expensive, or they couldn't do it on time. Or I think I'm now beginning to remember that I think there was concern that the academy was taking longer than expected, and it was very important that it opened on time in order to take the first year of admissions by September. I can't remember which year it was now. And because that was overrunning, the leisure centre, which was my particular interest, was also running behind, and we'd hoped it would be open because we were having to make alternative arrangements. So I think there was some worry that the projects which were being handled were taking longer than expected, And perhaps if the price was also not right, we thought it better to start again, or better if the TMO started again, or they thought it was better if they started again. But
Did you have any particular views about Leadbitter from what you knew about the Calc project?
I remember being worried that it was all taking too long and, trying to hurry things along or, encourage my officer team to encourage things along. And I think they were frustrated it was not happening as quickly as we would have liked. But
Right. And how was there any discussion about how not having Leadbitter for the Grenfell Tower project would assist the Calc project to meet its target date for completion?
no, I don't think so. I think it was more that there was a feeling that they weren't appropriate for handling the tower. This was quite a different type of project with residents remaining in situ. This work seemed to be overrunning. I think the tender was high, so I think the view was this wasn't the road to pursue.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you. We're going to have a short break now, Mr. Paget-Brown. We'll come back at 25 to 4. So if you'd like to go to the usher. The only other thing is please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Okay.
All right? Thank you very much. All right, 25 to 4, please. Yes, would you ask Mr. Paget-Brown to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. Paget-Brown, ready to carry on?
Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paget-Brown, I'm going to ask you some questions now about your interactions with the TMO. And I'm going to start with paragraph 57 of your first witness statement, page 13, please. And you say there, although I was not directly involved with housing issues, I recall that RBKC was concerned at some aspects of the TMO's performance around 2006 to 2010. The issues related to void properties, uncollected service charges payable by leaseholders, and problems with timely repairs would be regularly reported to the Cabinet Member for Housing and to the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee. And in paragraph 58, you say, while I was leader, having been aware of previous poor performance of the TMO, but having been advised that performance was now improving, I met the CEO, Robert Black, informally 3 to 4 times a year. The issues we discussed were largely driven by correspondence I had received about a range of issues. What was the basis of your awareness that the performance of the TMO had previously been poor?
Well, largely anecdotal from colleagues who, you know, again, in the margins of meetings or events where you met colleagues, and they would say, you know, there are issues with the TMO. It doesn't seem to be firing on all cylinders. There seem to be difficulties, structural difficulties with repairs. These leaseholder service charges, I think, became an issue which elected members would see because leaseholders would write, you know, very powerful letters saying, you know, how appalling it was that their service charges were so high, and then find that they hadn't been collected, and that then they were trying to collect them. It was one was very aware that there was an issue here that was not going well.
Were you aware during your time as deputy leader and later leader of a report called the Mamoli report from April 2009?
Well, no, I think I must have become aware of it since the events of 2017.
Right, after the fire?
Yes.
Right. But not before that?
Don't think so, but I did know there was an issue with the TMO and there were some changes, and no doubt they derived from that report, but that would have been a matter for the then Cabinet Member. And
I see. Well, let's just have a very quick look at it. IWS 401462. I'll just show you the first page of it. There it is. Does this look familiar to you from any time before the fire?
No.
No. And before 2013, when you became leader, did you have only limited interaction with the TMO?
Yes.
And did you begin meeting Robert Black because of your concerns about previous poor performance, or concerns that were held by others about previous poor performance?
Neither. I understood that over the previous 2 or 3 or 4 years before I'd become leader, the TMO performance was beginning to improve. I felt it wasn't an area I knew a huge amount about, and I thought as leader I ought to meet people that we did have important partnerships with. So obviously the TMO was one, my mail bag would have letters in occasionally about repairs, or it would have something in about antisocial behaviour. I just thought it was important I kept in touch with the chief exec of the TMO in a fairly informal way. So these were informal.
Yes. Why informal?
I think there were enough formal structures, and I didn't want to either cut across the Cabinet Member who had his responsibilities and regular meetings with the chief executive, or the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee, who had a proper and consequential role in holding the TMO to account. But I thought a friendly cup of coffee every 3 or 4 months and a discussion about certainly what was in my mailbox and what was probably in his was a good thing to do.
Right. Let's look at your second statement, please. And in that, can we please go to paragraph 32, where you say these meetings were not minuted. Perhaps we don't need to go to the paragraph. It's on page 10. You say the meetings I had with Robert Black were informal and not minuted.
Yes.
The main formal interface between RBKC and TMO was through the Housing Department, who would have more regular and detailed meetings which would be recorded.
Yes.
Why weren't those meetings minuted? Is it for the same reason that you gave before, which explained why they were informal?
Yes, I think once you have a formal meeting round a table with minutes taken, it changes the whole nature of the meeting. And I wanted it to be informal and to establish a relationship with Robert Black, to understand the issues that were worrying him and the TMO. And I didn't want to cut across, other meetings which are quite properly taking place between the cabinet member and the director of housing and probably the chief executive. So it just seemed to me something that I should be doing as leader and could do. And I prefer them not to be minuted, and there was no great. I wasn't sort of walking out of the meeting saying, we've got 14 things to do, and I now can't remember what they are.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Although they may not have been minuted, were any records made while you were at these meetings, either by you or, from what you could observe, by Robert Black?
I had a notebook, and I would scroll down a note or two, so it might remind me to discuss something with Feilding-Mellen or with Nicholas Holgate, or to perhaps follow something up that he'd mentioned. But these were notes for me, made by me, and they were sort of made memoirs. They weren't a formal minute of everything that we'd discussed and action points. They were just to remind me to follow up on particular issues.
If the TMO is intended to operate as an arm's-length contractor for RBKC, would you not want to have an agreed record of what transpired at meetings, however informal, between the men at the top of each of those organisations?
Well, I hadn't thought that. I thought there were enough formal structures to manage that important relationship and enough documents and bits of paper. I thought occasionally it was useful just to have a conversation, for me to have a look before we had the meeting through my list of correspondence, look at what, if anything, people had raised with me, and then I could raise it with Robert Black. I think he was quite keen to talk about how the TMO was improving and what he'd been doing, and I thought an informal meeting was better than a formal one.
Right. In the event that there was an action that arose, or perhaps a disagreement between you and Robert Black about who said what at what meeting, you would look at your daybook, would you?
Have a look in my daybook. I might have a word with Rock or with Laura Johnson, but I didn't want to cut across what they were doing. I didn't think that was going to be helpful.
Now, during your time as leader, were you aware of how oversight, supervision of the TMO was conducted by RBKC's housing department?
Only in broad terms.
Could you briefly describe those broad terms?
I think Rock Feilding-Mellen would have held regular policy boards, and very often, certainly at his policy boards, I would expect the Director of Housing for RBKC to be present, and appropriate members of her staff, as she and Rock thought best. And I'm sure that regularly they will have had Robert Black and other senior officers from the TMO to those meetings, and they would have discussed issues of mutual concern. The housing revenue account, the great problem really which came to light of the government instructing a 1% cut in rents, which I think was a big problem for the TMO. So yes, there were those structures, and then accountability to the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee.
And were you aware of which officers in the housing department were responsible for oversight of the TMO? You knew who they were?
I knew them by name. I don't think I'd necessarily met them, or if I had, it had been fleeting. Obviously knew Laura Johnson.
Yes, you had direct interaction with Laura Johnson.
Yes.
What about Amanda Johnson?
No, I'd seen her name probably on the occasional document. She may well have come occasionally to a leaders group. I'm not sure if there was something specific that she could comment on, but I see a lot of officers, and I'm afraid I can't always tally up names and faces.
Right, and would the same apply to Celia Chaliscan?
Yes.
Right. Were you aware that key performance indicators were used to monitor the performance of the TMO by RBKC?
That was the normal way in which all sorts of organisations, including council departments and contractors, were monitored. So I'm not specifically familiar with the KPIs for the TMO, but I'm not in the least surprised there were some.
I see. Did you ever become familiar with what the KPIs used by RBKC to monitor the TMO were?
Not item by item, no. but I'm sure they would have covered things like voids and the speed with which you relet a property, or outstanding arrears, or service charges, or the number of cleaning upsets. I think a big issue, actually going back to the conversations I would have with Robert Black and things that were in my mailbag, related to repairs. So I'm sure there were KPIs on repairs and speed of repairs.
Did you ever question whether the KPIs were appropriate or covered the right things?
No.
Why is that?
Well, I don't think I was necessarily professionally well enough qualified to know whether they were or weren't, and I've full confidence in Laura Johnson and Feilding-Mellen if they felt that there needed to be additional KPIs. And I'd had KPIs in areas for which I've been responsible. They're not always, they're not quite the magic tool you might expect them to be. They often count things, but they don't measure quality very well.
Were you aware that fire safety was not the subject of a KPI?
No.
Did you assume that it was?
No. I knew there were other ways of monitoring fire risk and measures which were being put in place, which I did know were being put in place, but I'm not sure I'd have thought a KPI was the only or the best tool for doing that.
Isn't that something you should have known as leader, namely that there was no KPI used by RBKC for monitoring TMO's activity in respect of fire safety?
Well, in retrospect, yes, I should have known that, but I didn't at the time, and it wasn't something which I was aware of or concerned about, but I should have been, I'm sure.
You do accept that?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to your second witness statement, paragraph 31, on page 10, you say this. And it's 6 lines down. I'm aware that the TMO also produced annual and mid-year performance reports. I do not recall whether I received copies of these or, in the event of copies being sent to my office, if I read them. As leader, I would receive copies of all scrutiny meeting papers, but would normally only read into a particular meeting if directed to consider a particular issue or if I wanted specific information, perhaps for a speech or external meeting. Councillor Feilding-Mellen would also have received the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee papers in his role as Cabinet Member for Housing, Property and Regeneration, and I would have expected him to raise any specific concerns with me. Given the history of poor performance at the TMO that you have told us about, why would you not have read the annual and mid-year performance reports as a matter of course, even if just to skim read them and see what they were saying?
I think occasionally I will have glanced at the reports of the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee, but as I've said here, there are a lot of these reports coming in from the different scrutiny committees and other council committee meetings, and you just simply couldn't keep pace with the quantity and detail of the material contained in them, and that's why you have a cabinet and why you have a absolutely confident in Feilding-Mellen's attention to all those details and key performance indicators and other matters contained in the reports. And as I say, I would have an informal discussion with Robert Black. I might occasionally just flick to a housing and property scrutiny report, but I think if I did that, it was probably only once or maybe twice.
Did you take it on trust that Mr. Feilding-Mellen was performing his oversight role of the TMO appropriately?
Well, not just on trust. I knew that he was. I knew there were, regular policy board meetings, that he was in regular contact with the director of housing at RBKC and the TMO senior people. And I thought he was very conscientious in the work he was doing.
I mean, look, we've looked at the Constitution. Do you accept that under the Constitution you were ultimately responsible as leader for ensuring that he was performing his role properly as Deputy Leader, as Cabinet Member for Property, Housing and Regeneration?
Yes, but I had no reason to think he wasn't.
You may have no reason to think he wasn't, but what did you actively do to hold him to account so that you could be satisfied yourself that your own obligations to supervise him were being discharged in full?
Well, that's why I think the meeting at the beginning of the year with each cabinet member, where I could cross-question them about what they were doing and what the big issues were, what concerns they had, what relationships with external organisations they had. That helps you to form a judgment on whether your cabinet members are, fulfilling the duties and responsibilities set out in the Constitution. And I had no reason to think that Rock was not doing that.
Now, sticking with your second statement, please, can we go forward to page 16 and look at paragraph 51 together? You're asked a question at the top of the page. At paragraph 73, that's your first statement, you state that with regard to the GT project, you expected all designs and materials to meet regulatory and statutory requirements and that you had the same expectations relating to fire safety measures. Question at A, what did you base these expectations on? And your answer is, in relation to the works themselves, it was the expectation of RBKC, and I would suggest any local authority and developer, that all council activity must conform to the relevant legislation. The detailed management of the project was undertaken by the TMO, who would have their own responsibilities and expectations, that any works undertaken would be in compliance with the various statutory and regulatory obligations. What did you understand RBKC's councillor's role to be, if any, in relation to ensuring fire safety compliance during the refurbishment of the Grenfell Tower property itself?
Well, the first thing to distinguish is that it was very clear that the contract for managing the refurbishment of the tower was a TMO contract, and government guidance made it clear that if you wish to qualify, this was for an earlier round of funding, but if you wish to qualify for that funding, you had to make sure your capital works team was a TMO team and not a council team. And I think at one stage it had been suggested that that shouldn't be the case. The council might continue to oversee capital works undertaken by the TMO. And the ruling came back, no, you can't do that. You must devolve all of that. So I think the councillor's role to that extent would be to ensure that the work employed all the right contractors who could give advice on those different, it's a very complex thing, refurbishing a tower. And I think when the works were done, there were all sorts of subcontractors and parties that the council would have expected to be there to advise on those different matters.
And just picking up on that last part of the answer, you say the councillor's role to that extent would be to ensure that the work employed all the right contractors who could give advice on those different things. How did you understand councillors would go about ensuring that the TMO employed all the right contractors?
Well, I would expect there to be regular updates to the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee on the project and what was being done and who was doing it and to whom the contract had been let, and what works were programmed, what works were going to be done. And then the expectation I think every councillor would have right across the council is that there's very strict regulatory guidance in all of these matters, and all those professional contractors would be expected to meet them. And they would have much more detail than an individual councillor on particular building standards and things like that.
Right. So did you expect that councillors, particularly Rock Feilding-Mellen in his role as cabinet member after 2013, would want to understand what contractual arrangements the TMO had made and had not made for the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower?
Well, yes, I would expect him to understand who was involved in the refurbishment and what their different roles were.
Right, and would you?
But not in. No, I think the detail for that would be with the TMO project team who were doing it. But I would expect Rock to receive reports on who they were and what their particular responsibilities were.
Do you know whether he ever did?
I don't know that, but I'd be surprised if he didn't. But that's speculation.
You'd be surprised if he didn't. Right.
Yes, if he didn't have a sort of working document that told him who was doing what and what Rydens were doing and what other contractors were doing. I would expect him to have known about that.
Would you have expected him to ask questions about why about whether there was a fire safety consultant or fire safety professional involved with the Grenfell Tower project, given particularly that there had been one involved with the Calc project?
I would have expected the TMO to appoint a suitable contractor and for Rock to know who that was.
Right. Yes, thank you. Were you aware that the Grenfell Tower project was by far and away the biggest capital project, certainly capital refurbishment project, the TMO had managed to date? When I say to date, 2012-13.
Well, no, except that the Decent Homes initiative, which was some 10 years before, I think, was quite a big programme. I think it was several tens of million pounds, probably. And I think they'd managed that quite successfully. So
I see what you mean. So the Decent Homes project may have been the largest monetarily. When I asked my question, let me try it differently. Were you aware that the Grenfell Tower project, as a single capital project for a single property, was by far the biggest project that the TMO had ever had to manage?
No.
You weren't aware of that?
No.
No. As leader, can you explain why you weren't aware of that?
Well, I don't think I would have asked as leader what projects they had been undertaking in the previous sort of 13 years. If you went from the year 2000 to 2013, I'm sure lots of buildings were refurbished, lots of works were carried out, and I wouldn't have necessarily been surprised to find them doing the refurbishment of a tower. I mean, towers do have to be refurbished, different works have to be done on towers, heating systems replaced. So I don't think the fact that several things were being done at Grenfell, I don't think would have particularly surprised me.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that this project had to come to full council for approval, as you agreed earlier, yes?
Full cabinet, yes.
Full cabinet?
Yes.
For approval, as you agreed earlier. And at that stage, did it not occur to you that this, in fact, was the biggest project that the TMO had ever managed as client?
No, I thought they had been managing other refurbishments and projects, and this may be the biggest, but it shouldn't have been. There are lots of smaller housing associations who do big projects, and this is a big project, and we had found the funding to do it, so there were going to be lots of contractors employed and consultants and advisors, so it didn't seem to me to be an undue stretch, but...
Did you yourself, as leader, or deputy leader before that, take any steps to ensure that the project manager, sitting in the TMO at the time, responsible for the project, and those who were overseeing him or then her, were suitably trained, experienced, and qualified to manage the project?
Well, I had visited the TMO, and I had visited the project team and the officer concerned, and looked at drawings and had a sort of short presentation as I went there, and I thought that he seemed to be very much in control of what needed to be done. I don't think, I didn't leave with any alarm bells ringing that this was a project beyond anybody's scope. I think they were.
Who was the he that you just referred to in that answer?
I think it was Peter Madison, who showed me some drawings of Grenfell and the proposed, and described the proposed work. So this must have been quite early on in my leadership, because I think the work wasn't yet started, or if it had started, it was at a very early stage.
Right. So sometime after May 2013.
Yes.
And let me just ask the question again. Did you take any steps, particularly looking at Peter Madison or perhaps Claire Williams, who took on the project managership, if you like, from September 2013? Did you take any steps to ensure yourselves that those people were suitably trained, experienced and qualified to manage it and to oversee the management of it?
No, I didn't.
And why is that?
Well, it seemed to me that they were senior members of the TMO, that they would have the appropriate skills for handling the refurbishment. I'm not sure I would have had the skills to see that there were skills they didn't have. And I was expecting that they would be hiring a raft of advisors, consultants. A lot of the budget was going to be allocated to that, who would, deal with the different issues, be it the heating system or the new windows or fire safety, and that was the way large projects were handled, across the council, and it didn't seem to me why it should be unduly different at the TMO.
Well, let me explore that. Did you realise at the time that the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project was the first major high-rise overcladding project the TMO had ever done?
No, I had thought that the Hazelwood Tower and Adair Tower had been thermally insulated some long time before, but I thought during the existence of the TMO. So, no, I don't think it crossed my mind, particularly that this was a strange project or a project with which they wouldn't be familiar.
Right. Did you yourself take any steps to make sure or to investigate that the TMO executives responsible for the Grenfell Tower project knew enough about cladding a high-rise to be able to hold their contractors to account in compliance with all the legal requirements that applied and all the industry guidance that applied?
No, I didn't.
And why is that?
I'm not sure. I didn't think it occurred to me at the time of the visit that fitting cladding to a building was an unduly... this was happening all over London. It seemed to me, as I said, in many cases, that Kensington and Chelsea was sort of behind the curve on it, and that when I heard, I think Rydens were going to be the chief contractor, that doing this was not this was not rocket science. Lots of buildings have cladding put on, as we since discovered. I mean, this is something housing associations and councils and ALMOs have been doing for 15 years, and we were a little bit behind the curve. And as I understood it, the senior officers at the TMO all had, CVs that were appropriate. They come from the house, they were housing professionals. So,
did you yourself personally take any active steps to monitor the project?
Well, I think I made a hard hat visit, as they call it, probably about halfway through. I can't remember. It's somewhere in the documents it lists when. And as I say, I was lobbied about the boxing club and the nursery, but beyond that, no.
And you say, we don't need to go to it, in your first statement of paragraph 58, page 13, that the issues you discussed were driven largely by the correspondence you'd received from a range of issues, or about a range of issues. You'd received, I think, issues, complaints, concerns from residents of the Lancaster West Estate, particularly Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
Yes. Were you not concerned to check up on the major capital project that the TMO is undertaking so far as concerned those residents?
Well, no, I think there's two issues here, if I can unpick them. One is I had received correspondence about the Lancaster West Estate. These are the finger blocks which weren't going to be refurbished. And very early on, I'd been written to about that. Then when the work started, I think there were concerns about delays. It was taking time to get the works underway. But I think Rock was handling that. Then I got a complaint, which I referred to earlier, which I admitted from the statement from Mr. Daffan about wanting to make a complaint about the windows and the planners and the windows, which I took as a technical matter, and I had to get advice on how you deal with complaints and that kind of thing. As I say, I made the occasional visit to Grenfell while the works were underway. I was pleased to see what was being done, but no, I'm not a technician, so some of those issues would not have been raised by me, but I would have expected them to be raised by professional people that have been hired to raise them.
Fire risk assessments. I just want to ask you one or two questions about that topic. Were you aware during your time as leader that there was an an ongoing programme of fire risk assessments done in relation to the TMO housing stock?
Yes, because I think there'd been a bad fire in a block in Southwark, and all sorts of actions had flowed from that, and that included and affected the TMO.
That's the Lakanal House fire?
The Lakanal House fire.
In July 2009?
Yes.
Did you ever receive any reports in relation to the progress of the fire risk assessment programme or actions taken to complete items listed in the action plans relating to them?
I didn't, but I think the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee would have received updates, and I think I'd understood either from Robert Black or Laura Johnson that there was a programme of replacing, I think, assessing fire door safety after the Lakanal House fire. I think there's two types of doors, if I've understood it. One is the fire door onto the communal staircase or lift area, and the other is the front door of the individual property. And I think they all had to be looked at, and I think in many cases replaced. And I think there was a fire door replacement programme.
Did you keep tabs on that?
Not in any great detail, no.
Right. Were you aware of the identity of the people conducting the fire risk assessments from your time as deputy leader or leader?
No, I knew there were fire risk assessments, and I think I knew the TMO had an in-house specialist who they hired to do it.
In-house, did you think?
I'm not sure it was in-house or whether they had a contractor to do them, but they had somebody. I think they had taken steps since Lakanal House to do more fire risk assessments in line with what the LFB requirements were.
Right. Really what I'm going to try to get a sense of is how much you knew about all of that.
A bit, but not a lot.
Right. What bit?
That doors were being assessed and, if necessary, replaced, and that there were two types of door. And I think I've been advised, probably much later, when there was another fire in a different block, that there had been an issue with the doors closing, and I think they're supposed to have an automatic closer. And in fact, I remember that from I think that goes back quite a long time. And sometimes those closers are disabled, and
yes.
The door doesn't close, and then you get a smoke egress.
Yes. Is that the Adair fire?
Yes.
Tower fire?
The Adair Tower fire, yes.
Yeah. Can I ask you to look at your notebook? Which
Yeah.
RBK 3060883. And at page 13, that's page 1. In page 13, you see that there's a note on 13th of April 2016. Now, it looks as if that is a post-it note, but perhaps you can help us.
So I think it may have gone, the post-it note. I did see it, now it's disappeared.
It should be on your screen.
Ah, it is now.
Oh, I see.
But they go small.
Yes, yes. In fact, it looks like there are two parts to it. There's a post-it note which says "Meeting with Robert B. 13 April 16 Adair fire," and then underneath that there's a date 13 April or 13.4.16 Robert Black. It looks as if that latter date is actually in your notebook. Does this record a meeting with Robert Black that you had on the 13th of April 2016 to discuss the Adair fire? The Adair Tower fire?
There clearly was a meeting with Robert Black. I don't think it was specifically to discuss the Adair Tower, and the post-it note might either be to remind me to discuss it with him, or because we did discuss it, but I'm not sure why I put that date on it.
Is that your handwriting on the post-it?
Yes, no, it's my note, definitely.
Okay. I'm being slightly unfair to you. Can we scroll down a little bit on page 13 and see the whole of the entry under that date? If you look down the text, you can see 4 lines up from the bottom. It says, Adair Tower fire checks smoke should have stayed indoors, enforcement notices in or on automatic door closers, and then, can you read the last line to me, please?
Parking enforcement on TMO land.
Parking enforcement on TMO land. Do you recall this meeting, independently of the note?
Well, I don't recall it in any detail, but clearly it took place, and it looks like a regular, routine, sort of informal meeting with Robert Black. And as I was trying to explain earlier, I would write down the odd note during the meeting, and that's what I've done here.
Is this a good example of what you told us earlier about how you...
Yeah, it's not very grammatical, but it is, yes.
Well, I think we'll forgive you for that. But did Mr. Black tell you that as a consequence of the smoke dispersal through the building, the TMO faced an enforcement notice from the London Fire Brigade for the absence of door closers?
Well, I've written that down, and I think he must have told me that. Yes, I don't think I'd known before the meeting, and it looks like a note. Yeah, and I think subsequently I discussed it with Nicholas Holgate, and he told me there was an issue with smoke in the block, and I think the fire brigade had to evacuate the whole block, or certainly a big chunk of it, because doors had been open when they should have been closed, and smoke had got out.
Yes. Did that alarm you when
Yes.
you discovered that fact?
Yes.
It did. Did you follow up with Mr. Black to see whether the enforcement notice had been properly complied with?
I don't remember following it up with him, but I think it would have been on. I'm sure it would have been on everybody's radar. So Feilding-Mellen, Laura Johnson, Nicholas Holgate, was obviously on mine to an extent. And I think it came back to something to do with closers, door closers. And I think then there'd be an issue about, who was going to fund door closers. Door closers, yes.
Do you remember that? Do you remember a discussion about funding a door closer programme?
No, I don't. But I'm sure somebody had a conversation about it. I'm not sure it was me, but I'm sure that would have been an issue. I don't know how extensive that notice was and whether it was just door closers in Adair, because there were two towers, Adair Tower and Hazelwood Tower, which I mentioned earlier, which I think had got cladding on the outside. And so I suppose door closers would need to be replaced in both blocks and then probably elsewhere. I have to say I don't know the extent of the LFB notice.
Do you remember any discussion about the length of programme to be put in place in response to the LFB's requirement in relation to door closures?
No, I don't.
You don't remember a discussion about whether it should be a 3-year programme or a 5-year programme?
No, I don't remember that. I think, wouldn't there be a prioritisation of? I think with the LFB, don't they want high risk, medium risk, low risk, and then you start with your high risk and work through them.
Is that how you understood it to work, or supposed to work?
Yes, I think that's what I did understand. That's how the fire brigade looked at things, and I think after Lacanel House, there had been a ranking of priority, high priority, medium priority, low priority, and I assume that's what happened with the door closers.
Yes, and did you assume, perhaps more generally, that the TMO would follow the high, medium, and low risk assessments conducted by either identified by the LFB or identified by the fire risk assessor?
Yeah, I think my understanding was there were regular meetings between the LFB and the TMO, and the TMO would be complying with the LFB requirements.
That was your expectation?
Yes.
Right. Did you, as a result of being told about this enforcement notice, make any further inquiries about the fire risk assessment programme and how that was going?
No, I don't think so.
Did the arrival of these enforcement notices lead you to question whether or not the fire risk assessor, whom the TMO were using, was any good?
No, it didn't, no.
Why is that?
I think because it comes back to the point about key performance indicators. You can fit closers. Closers may then be removed from doors. So there's an awful lot of, you could do a fire risk assessment and say, well, the closers have been fitted, or the doors fit, or the doors comply. And then you might find that actually it went back 3 weeks later and things were different. I think it's a very fast-moving thing. So no, I didn't follow it up, and I do realise there is an issue about closing flat doors.
Did you think at the time that although it may be difficult to keep up with tenants removing their door closers for various reasons, nonetheless you needed to have a regime of regular inspection and maintenance to make sure, as best you could, that door closers remained in place and working? Did that occur to you as a result of this meeting?
It didn't occur to me, but I think it would come back to the issue of repairs, and there is a big issue which they did explain to me at the TMO again in one of my visits. Repairs and gaining access to property is quite a big challenge for the TMO. Very often, you find that when you go to a property, the tenant's not there, or it's not a convenient time to do the repair, or that you need access to a different property. So I think there is a real sort of endemic issue with the TMO about, and this was the big issue always about repairs, I think throughout the whole time I was leader, that getting them done in a prompt way was not nearly as easy as it sounded, and your KPIs might look very bad and all the rest, but the real issue is gaining access to the property and putting the problem right. And I think that's how fire door closers would also, you'd need the same thing if you were going to get in and change them and then check they were still all right a year later.
Can we then look at TMO 1001724, please? TMO 1001724. This is a notice of deficiency issued by the LFEPA to Janice Ray at the TMO, dated the 17th of November 2016. And you can see that the premises concerned are Grenfell Tower. And in the first paragraph, you can see that action is required by the 18th of May 2017, just at the foot of your screen. Were you told about this notice of deficiency at the time, November 2016?
No, I don't think I was, no.
Is that because of a failure of procedural process, or because the procedural process at RBKC was not designed to get that kind of information up to you?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look at more detail here about what was not in compliance with the fire safety order, and whether it was a minor thing or a big thing, and was this a problem with the refurbishment that had been exacerbated by the refurbishment, or was it so I probably need to see more of the letter, but
yes.
Wouldn't necessarily expect that to come to me. I would expect it to go to the TMO and for them to comply with it. And,
yes.
I think they had regular liaison with the London Fire Brigade, so but I'd need to know more about this, I think.
Well, let me help you. Page 5, we can see the schedule, and there are 3 points on that page, which are picked up, Article 11, Article 17, twice, and they are about fire doors in each case, and also the lack of self-closers on 2 particular flats. If you look at the bottom of page 5 and the top of page 6 in the left-hand column, and again under Article 14 on page 6, doors to flat 44 and 153 did not self-close.
Right.
As well as other things as well, damage to the service duct on the 8th floor, and fire action notice is not displayed in the common parts, matters of that nature. So does that help you with why this document wasn't, as it were, escalated to you for you to know about?
Yes, can you just remind me of the date of it? Because was it while the works were still underway and why there were things in the corridors, or was it when the work was over and done with?
It was when the work was, well, it was during the defects period, I think, but it was 17th of November 2016.
Right, so
and
afterwards, yes.
Practical completion for the refurbishment had happened in the previous July.
Yes, no, I'm not familiar with this.
Right, you're not. Are you surprised that you hadn't seen it before, or hadn't seen it at the time? Well,
I always received reports where there had been a fire. I'm surprised somebody didn't mention this to me, I have to say. I would have thought it would have
Right.
been mentioned, and I would have obviously raised it with Robert Black or with Nicholas Holgate or perhaps with Laura Johnson. But no, I hadn't seen that. But
Right. Let's then look at an email chain in January 2017. This is at RBK 401038, please. And we can start on page 2 of that run with Janice Ray forwarding to Robert Black a letter received from the LFB confirming that the work specified as necessary and in the Adair Tower enforcement notice had been carried out. That's what the first paragraph says. And if you go over the page, up the page rather, to page 1 and look at the foot of that page, you can see that Robert Black forwards it in turn the same day to Laura Johnson, and he says this. Laura, for information somewhere it might be good to meet to look at how we respond to the fire brigade, as I think we are being driven down a road by a group which seems to be unaccountable. Is the overall responsibility for this moving to the mayor? Might give us and LA political leaders to influence this area more. Did you have a discussion along these lines with Mr. Black?
I don't think so. I don't quite understand the content of the letter. I mean, what group which seems to be unaccountable? Was there some? No, I don't recognise this at all.
No. Well, let me. I'm not sure I've really contextualised it fully for you, but the context for this is the LFB making stringent demands on the TMO about door closers, particularly as a result of the Adair Tower enforcement notice. And I hope I'm not paraphrasing inaccurately. What Mr. Black seems to be saying here is that the group LFB is unaccountable, and well, he says what he says there. Is the tenor of this discussion something familiar to you?
No, it isn't.
Right. Did Mr. Black ever speak to you about bringing more political influence to bear in the TMO's dealings with the LFB?
No, he didn't. No, I don't think so. No.
Right. What about to others, to your knowledge? Did Mr. Black ever make any suggestion of that sort to others within RBKC, as far as you were aware?
No, I'm not aware of that. And I don't quite understand the reference to his overall responsibility for this moving to the mayor. I'm not quite sure what might be moving to the mayor.
No, and nor was Laura Johnson, in fact, in her message. But you can't help me with that, I think.
No, I don't think I can.
Right. Mr. Chairman, it's 4:25. I can start a new topic now. We won't get very far, but I'm never keen to waste 5 minutes.
Well, I know you're not. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to me that you're going to finish your questions.
I'm not.
Mr. Paget-Brown this evening.
I'm not, no.
In which case it might be better to call a halt at that point.
Yes.
Mr. Paget-Brown, I don't know whether you were warned that we might need to ask you to come back tomorrow. I had hoped that we would complete your evidence today, but it, I'm afraid, hasn't turned out that way. And I think possibly we might break at that point and get a fresh start tomorrow.
Yes.
Can you give us any idea of...
Yes. About an hour before we finish, and then there'll be the usual break and then further questions. So I would be optimistic about finishing
by midday.
Well, better than that. I'm optimistic we'd finish. Optimistic, but not with any guarantee that we'd finish completely by the morning break.
Yes.
Particularly if the morning break was perhaps a little later than
All right. Well, Mr. Paget-Brown, I asked Mr. Millett that because I thought it might help you to know roughly how long we might need to detain you tomorrow. Whatever Mr. Millett says, I think you would be, it would be reasonable for you to expect to get away from here by midday. And that, if that helps you so much, the better. I'm sorry we've got to get you back. But as it is, we're going to stop there for the afternoon. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you very much, sir.
And I must ask you not to talk about your evidence or anything relating to it over the break, all right?
Sure.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to go to the usher. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you. Well, Mr. Millett, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I sounded a bit pessimistic, but
Always good to be realistic.
experience suggests that sometimes these things take a bit longer than one expects. So we'll stop there and resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please. All right. Thank you very much.